The Trump administration's intervention in Venezuela, meant to restore democracy, ended up serving China's interests more than America's. While Washington was distracted and expending resources, Beijing quietly expanded its global influence, capitalizing on America's focus elsewhere. The paradox: an America First policy that ultimately benefited its chief rival. This episode became a real-time experiment in global leadership, military intervention versus economic partnership. The Venezuela story is less about one nation's fate and more about the subtle transfer of global influence from west to east. The U.S. framed its intervention as a moral crusade to save Venezuela from Maduro's failed regime. Images of suffering and repression rallied support at home and abroad, with allies initially backing Juan Guaidó as interim president. The administration promised a swift, peaceful transition, but seasoned diplomats warned of unintended consequences and historical baggage. Critics noted that regime change efforts often backfire, strengthening adversaries and alienating allies. The media focused on the immediate drama, rarely asking how China might exploit the situation. The real question: would this intervention strengthen America's global position or hand China a strategic advantage? The answer would soon become clear. Globally, America's intervention was seen less as a defense of democracy and more as another example of U.S. overreach. China, by contrast, promoted itself as a non-interfering partner, offering loans and infrastructure without political strings. This approach appealed to many nations wary of Western intervention. The Venezuelan crisis highlighted two models: U.S. force versus Chinese partnership. China's image as a pragmatic, reliable ally grew, while America's actions fueled skepticism and calls for alternatives to U.S.-led systems. Beijing used Venezuela as a rhetorical shield against U.S. criticism, pointing to American hypocrisy. The intervention, meant to project strength, instead exposed the limits of U.S. power. America's long and complex history of intervention, from covert operations in Iran to open warfare in Iraq, has left a deep imprint on global perceptions. Each time the United States stepped into another nation's affairs, it claimed to champion democracy or protect its interests. But these actions often fueled suspicion and resentment, especially in regions like Latin America, where memories of past interventions linger. When Venezuela's crisis erupted, many around the world questioned whether America's motives were truly altruistic, or if it was another chapter in a familiar playbook of regime change and power projection. These interventions frequently led to instability, economic hardship, and a surge in anti-American sentiment. Even close allies grew cautious, wary of being drawn into another costly and unpredictable conflict. The shadow of previous regime change efforts made international partners hesitant to fully support U.S. strategies, fearing unintended consequences and backlash from their own citizens. In stark contrast, China charted a different course. Rather than military involvement or political pressure, Beijing focused on economic development and a policy of non-interference. Through trade deals, infrastructure investments, and financial partnerships, China steadily expanded its influence, presenting itself as a reliable and pragmatic partner to developing nations. During the Venezuelan crisis, the U.S. doubled down on pressure, imposing sanctions, issuing stern warnings, and rallying international condemnation. China, meanwhile, sent diplomats and financiers, offering loans and economic lifelines instead of ultimatums. This divergence in approach was impossible to ignore. Beijing restructured Venezuela's mounting debts, kept buying its oil, and provided much-needed cash flow. These moves not only ensured President Maduro's political survival, but also deepened China's reputation as a steadfast, results-oriented partner, one that prioritized stability and mutual benefit over ideology. Around the globe, observers saw a familiar American playbook, marked by intervention and confrontation, set against a Chinese alternative that emphasized partnership, investment, and respect for sovereignty. For many countries, especially those wary of foreign interference, China's model began to look increasingly attractive. The contrast was stark. On one side, intervention and pressure; on the other, partnership and pragmatic engagement. This clear divide forced nations to reconsider their alliances and the kind of global order they wanted to support. In the end, China's approach paid dividends long after the world's attention moved on. Its investments continued to shape Venezuela's future, while America's legacy of intervention remained a cautionary tale for others. Many believed the US needed Venezuelan oil for energy security, but by then, America was already the world's top oil producer. The real energy story was China's dependence on imports and its push into renewables. Disrupting Venezuela's oil supply affected China more than the US, as Beijing was the world's largest oil importer. China's long-term strategy focused on diversifying energy sources, while America's intervention seemed outdated. The US didn't need Venezuelan oil, but the chaos it caused introduced volatility that ultimately benefited China. The focus on oil missed the bigger picture, a transformed global energy landscape. When the United States imposed sweeping sanctions on Venezuela, the goal was clear: to cripple President Nicolás Maduro's regime by cutting off its most vital source of income. Oil revenue. Washington hoped that by squeezing Venezuela's finances, it would force political change. But the global oil market, ever complex and interconnected, responded in ways few had fully anticipated. To prevent a sudden spike in global oil prices, which could hurt American consumers and the world economy, the US quietly encouraged its allies and domestic producers to ramp up oil output. Oil rigs in Texas and fields in the Middle East worked overtime, ensuring that the market remained well supplied and prices stayed relatively moderate despite the loss of Venezuelan crude. This strategy, while stabilizing prices for the West, turned out to be a massive windfall for China. As the world's largest oil importer, China benefited enormously from the artificially low prices, saving billions of dollars on its energy bill. Chinese refineries ran at full tilt, processing cheap oil and fueling the country's rapid industrial growth. Meanwhile, Venezuela, cut off from most Western markets, was forced to sell its oil at steep discounts just to keep cash flowing. The main buyers willing to take the risk? China and Russia. Tankers loaded with Venezuelan crude sailed east, often under the radar, as Caracas accepted bargain basement prices in exchange for desperately needed revenue. For Beijing, this was a golden opportunity. Not only did China secure a steady supply of cheap oil, but it also deepened its economic and political influence in Venezuela. Chinese engineers and investment poured into the country's oil sector, further cementing the partnership. Instead of isolating Maduro, America's policy made him increasingly dependent on China for survival. The Venezuelan leader found a powerful new patron, one less concerned with human rights and more interested in energy security and strategic alliances. In effect, the intervention ended up subsidizing China's economic growth while costing the US billions in lost influence and unforeseen consequences. American taxpayers and policymakers watched as their efforts backfired, strengthening a rival power. What was intended as a blow to an adversary became a strategic miscalculation, one that shifted the balance of power, all courtesy of American foreign policy. Despite public talk of democracy, US officials openly cited oil and business interests as motives for intervention. This candor confirmed suspicions that the policy was about resources, not ideals, undermining America's moral standing. The contradiction was clear. If the US was energy independent, why pursue Venezuela's oil? Many concluded the real aim was to deny resources to rivals like China, or benefit select corporations. This eroded international norms of sovereignty and set a dangerous precedent for global power politics. America's actions weakened the very rules it once championed. The long-term cost: a world more accepting of intervention by any major power. The US's hardline approach strained alliances as European partners grew uneasy with talk of military intervention. Allies favored diplomacy and dialogue, not regime change, leading to divisions within the Western Bloc. China exploited these rifts, presenting itself as a champion of multilateralism and a stable partner. While America alienated friends, China deepened ties with Europe through trade and investment. The Venezuela crisis accelerated Europe's move toward a more independent foreign policy. A divided West weakened its ability to respond to China's rise. The greatest gift to Beijing: a fractured Western alliance. In the aftermath of the crisis, the United States found itself with little to show for its extensive efforts in Venezuela. Despite significant investment and international attention, President Nicolás Maduro remained firmly in power, his regime battered but unbroken. The country itself was left in ruins, its economy and infrastructure devastated, and its people facing ongoing hardship. Yet, as the dust settled, it became clear that a new player had quietly gained ground amid the chaos: China. Beijing moved swiftly to secure access to Venezuela's vast oil reserves at bargain prices, locking in long-term energy deals that would fuel its own growth for years to come. By offering loans and technical expertise, China not only expanded its economic footprint, but also presented its non-interventionist approach as an attractive alternative to Western involvement. This strategy resonated with many developing nations watching from afar. The U.S. intervention, intended to restore order and democracy, inadvertently created a power vacuum. China was quick to fill this gap, leveraging its financial resources and diplomatic clout to sign lucrative contracts, extend credit lines, and deepen its relationships across Latin America. Chinese construction crews and engineers became a common sight in Venezuela, symbolizing a new era of partnership. This episode reinforced China's preference for a patient, economically driven strategy over direct military involvement. Through initiatives like the Belt and Road, Beijing demonstrated that influence could be built through infrastructure, trade, and investment, rather than force. Meanwhile, America's intense focus on Venezuela meant less attention was paid to China's expanding presence elsewhere. As Washington became bogged down in the complexities of regime change, Beijing quietly advanced its interests on multiple fronts. The law of unintended consequences was on full display. What began as an attempt to reassert U.S. dominance in the Western Hemisphere ended up accelerating a global shift in power, with China emerging as the unexpected beneficiary. In the end, the real winner was Beijing. By playing the long game, exercising patience, and focusing on economic leverage, China quietly reaped the rewards of a changing world order, strengthening its position on the global stage. The Venezuela intervention now stands as a powerful lesson in modern geopolitics, a reminder that tactical actions, no matter how well-intentioned, can sometimes undermine broader strategic goals. In this new era, the ability to adapt and think several moves ahead may prove more valuable than sheer power alone.